Welcome back to the Foreign Policy Week in Review with Daniel McAdams of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Thank you for joining me again, Daniel.
Hi, Jay. Thanks for having me back.
Always good to talk to you about the latest goings on in the world of geopolitics to try to get an honest view of what's happening as opposed to the propaganda that keeps penetrating our airwaves. Almost you just can't get away from it. We are being indoctrinated on an ongoing basis with views that seem to serve some people, perhaps a very small elite, but it doesn't seem to be benefiting most Americans if they really understood what was going on. And so that's what we try to do on this show and on this podcast, and of course what the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity tries to do and does do very effectively with numerous articles. The Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Go there, folks, and learn what you can about what is really happening in geopolitics. Learn what lies behind the bloodshed and the treasury that's being spent and is being funded by average, honest, good, hard-working Americans. Well, Daniel, we've been talking about the Iranian agreement that President Obama has tried to put in place that would seems to me, based on what you told me and what we've learned about it, and certainly a lot of people in the mainstream too, seem to be behind it. I heard Gary Sick, for example, who was in the Carter administration, come out in favor of it. But there are the neocons, of course, that don't really seem to want to have anything to do with peace. And, they'll always go back to Neville Chamberlain and try to talk about peace at any price or peace at any cost, or whatever, and talk about how foolish it is to make peace with evil people. We're the good guys and everyone else is evil. But in any event, where does this Iranian agreement stand now, Daniel? I saw something about some compromise between Obama and the Senate.
Sure, exactly. And I have to say, as an aside, Jay, this may shock you, but in some ways I agree with the neocons. There shouldn't be a deal. Mm-hmm. But I agree for different reasons. I don't think this entire fear of the Iranian nuclear weapon has all been ginned up as propaganda by the neocons in the U.S. and in Israel. So it's all based on lies anyway. So we've talked about this too, Jay. In a little bit more perfect of a world, it would be none of our business how Iran decides to enrich its uranium, mm-hmm. and just like it's none of our business how Israel decides to defend itself, it's none of our business how Iran decides to defend itself either. Mm-hmm. So in a better world, we wouldn't even be involved in this, but I think in a more practical, I guess, realpolitik world, those of us who believe that war is destructive to our economy and to our moral character, not even discussing the loss of lives and destruction of property involved, the nuclear deal is all in all probably something that, if it does forestall war, is a good thing. So what happened this past week, if you remember, the Corker-Menendez bill mm-hmm. was a bill entered into the Senate, which was entered into the guise of giving Congress a role in the process, and that is, as Dr. Paul has said, Congress obviously should take a role in these processes, and he spent a lot of time decrying the fact that Congress doesn't take more of a role
right.
in things like war and peace. However, as he's pointed out, the leadership that is behind this legislation is not doing it for constitutional reasons. They're doing it simply because they want to scuttle the deal. Mm-hmm. So in a real quick nutshell, what it would have done, the Corker-Menendez bill would have made a 60-day waiting period after an agreement is reached, during which the Senate would review and vote on whether they agree with the president's agreement. And in that time, the U.S. would not be able to lift, the president would not be able to lift sanctions that the president otherwise has the authority unilaterally to lift. I know it's getting a little bit into the trees, but if you can bear with me just really quickly. So there was a compromise made, and that compromise was critical because the Democrats got on board for various reasons, mostly political. But when the Democrats started getting on board with this compromise version of the bill, the president realized he no longer had a veto-proof, override-proof veto. Sorry,
yeah.
on the bill, and so he had to sort of reluctantly concede that he would not veto the bill. What the compromise does, it reduces that time for the Senate to look at the agreement to 30 days, during which time the president cannot lift sanctions against Iran.
Oh.
And it also removes the requirement that the president demonstrate to Congress every 90 days that Iran is no longer or is not sponsoring terrorism. So and Dr. Paul and I did a section of his Liberty Report on this earlier this week. It's sort of a typical Congress bill because they start out trying to do everything and end up really doing nothing, because after this 30 days, it's very unlikely that Congress will vote in favor of it. We know that because the Republicans are in charge. But there's also not enough to have a veto-proof majority against it.
Oh.
And so if Congress doesn't vote either way, then it goes into effect anyway. So it's sort of much ado about nothing. Senators can go home and say, yeah, we stuck it to Obama, or yeah, we stuck up for Obama.
Yeah.
Everyone feels good and nothing happens. So I think that's a best case scenario. There's been a lot of doom and gloom that this will scuttle it. At least in my reading, I think it means very little. However, I don't think they have stopped their efforts to try to put this agreement off track.
Okay. Well,
So, sorry for the long.
no, that's good. And in fact, if people are more interested in learning more, they can go to the Ron Paul Institute website and hear your discussion with Dr. Paul about that issue in more depth, I suppose, right?
Yes, exactly. We did a segment of his report again, as I say, on it.
Well, I think it's a very important issue, as all of them are that we discuss, that you enlighten us with here, Daniel, in our discussions. The next topic I'd like to ask you about is the Ukraine. What's going on there? U.S. military now, we're actually sending troops there. We're sending military hardware there. What are we doing in the Ukraine now?
Yeah, it's been an active week in Ukraine, I have to say, after a bit of a lull. The ceasefire is holding tentatively. However, there's been a huge uptick in military activity this past week. And even the OSCE, which has been pretty reluctant to criticize the West-backed government in Kiev, even the OSCE has said that a lot of these mortars and things are coming from Kiev, the Kiev side, the U.S.-backed side. So this is the first time we've seen that. But there have been literally thousands of shells fired in the past few days. So you're seeing a serious uptick in that respect. The two other very important events in Ukraine this week, neither of which bode very well for future peace, is, as you mentioned, the arrival of U.S. paratroopers, the U.S. Army paratroopers, up to 300, possibly even more. They're going to be training the Ukrainian, i.e. the West-backed Kiev Ukrainian army in infantry tactics. And if you step back and think about this for a second, it's extremely provocative, and I would say highly improper when you have a country that's in the midst of an unsolved civil conflict to have an outside power coming in on one side to start training that side in better tactics and better war fighting, and all at the same time screaming that the Russians are involved on the other side. So it's very strange, but it's also, I think, extremely dangerous to have American troops on Ukrainian soil when there's this huge conflict. In a way, it's irresponsible for the Pentagon to do this because these young men and women are going to be sitting ducks anyway, almost tripwires. There's enormous incentive if you want to have a provocation to suck the U.S. further into the conflict. You're gonna want to, sadly enough, to knock a few of these guys off and make it look like the Russians did it, or any number of things could happen. So it really, really is a dangerous situation to bring these in. And the third and final thing, I think, which makes it sort of a dangerous trifecta this week, is the fact that yet at least two, and I think three more high-profile individuals in Ukraine that have been associated or affiliated with the previous government of Yanukovych have been murdered, have been assassinated.
Oh, boy.
One of them was a member of parliament. That happened 2 days ago. And then yesterday, I believe it was, a very prominent journalist. He was the editor-in-chief previously of the main now opposition newspaper, the paper associated with Yanukovych. He was assassinated in front of his house. So that makes, I think, at least 11 or 12 individuals associated with or sympathetic to the Yanukovych government who've either had very suspicious suicides or have been out and out assassinated.
Hmm.
And Dr. Paul and I did a segment of his show about this today, which we'll be posting soon. And he pointed out that, if you remember a month or so ago when this Russian opposition politician, a relatively minor figure, but an opposition figure nevertheless, was killed in front of the Kremlin. If you remember, John Kerry, that just minutes later, was telling the Russians they better investigate this and suggesting that,
Right.
that Putin was behind it and
Right.
this and that. And here you have 11 or 12 people of much higher rank than the Russian guy who was killed that have been assassinated. And I went back before I did the show with Dr. Paul. As far as my research shows, the U.S. government has not said a single word about these killings. So
About investigating these assassinations.
not even condolences. Not even.
No.
It's just like it didn't exist.
Well, you
So-
would think that the American government is such a fair-minded, objective-minded government. They would certainly want to know who bumped off these people, just because we're good people and we're fair and objective, right? Americans.
Yeah.
We love democracy. We love fairness. Yeah, right. Well, when I think about it, I was just thinking about an analogy, Daniel. You said about the United States sending troops into a country that's having a civil war. That would be something like during our Civil War if the British decided to take sides with the South, perhaps, huh?
Sure, exactly, and it's highly inappropriate. It's dangerous. I mean, the U.S. did these sorts of things in the 80s in Latin America.
Yeah.
It's always looked at as kind of a dark day for the
Yeah.
U.S. And of course, the Soviets did these sorts of things as well. And it's interesting because Putin, who does this crazy thing where he sits and answers questions from the population for 4 or 5 hours, it's pretty amazing. But he made a point while he was answering these questions, and he said, we in Russia have got to face up to the fact that the Soviet Union, when it was in the Khrushchev era, was doing these kinds of things, was involving itself in the internal affairs of countries in the Eastern Bloc, was fomenting discontent, and we have to come to terms with this, with what we did. But the U.S. also needs to come to terms with the fact that it's doing the same things today.
Yeah.
And it's,
Right.
I think, a very good point.
Right. Very good. Well, that's kudos to him for that, because that's I mean, but clearly though there are people that don't really want peace. That's obvious to me, and that would start, as far as I'm concerned, with the neocons here in America. They certainly wouldn't want to hear you say that. Well, they're nothing but peaceful people. They just are kind of peace, like it's the big bully in school that wants to win the basketball game and knocks the little kids around and stuff, right?
And they don't realize the horrors of the war that they might unleash.
Yeah.
It's beyond imagination. I grew up when I was a very young kid, and I'm sure the same is true for you, Jay. Ducking under the tables when
Yes.
they had the 4 long bells, I think it was,
Yes.
for
Yes.
a nuclear attack. And never did I think I'd be explaining to my children that this is a threat again. It's just it's beyond my belief.
Well, it's a threat that in America we no longer worry about because we have the upper hand, of course, Daniel, and we don't have to worry about nuclear war here. It's just we'll give it to others, but we're strong enough. We got defense systems strong enough that we never have to worry about getting hit with nuclear weapons in the United States, right?
It's sad that people believe the propaganda, but
Yeah,
God forbid if these neocons push it, God forbid what will happen.
Right. So, I mean, if people were aware of the dangers, then there would be more opposition to what's going on. As it is, just keep people to lots of bread and circus. Baseball, I love baseball. Baseball playoffs in hockey, playoffs in basketball. Now, Daniel, we don't have to think about these things. We can just really enjoy ourselves, drink a little wine, have a good time, right? So who cares, right?
Yeah.
All those people over there with their homes bombed out, death, and it's just we can't imagine. I can't imagine living in a still nice area here in Queens about what life is like in most good parts of the world where we're just killing thousands of people. But in any event, Yemen is another place where lots of innocent people are being killed. Can you give us an update on Yemen? What's anything you might have posted on the website on Yemen recently?
Well, the slaughter continues in Yemen. Saudi Arabia is bombing Yemen from the air for several weeks now. There have been, I think, about 3,000 people killed. It looks like from the latest statistics, 381 of them were children, 455 of them were women. The infrastructure is destroyed. We put up a great piece by Moon of Alabama, which is a very good website. They point out that fuel prices have increased by 600%, bread by 300%. There's no gas for cooking. There's no electricity for water pumps. And these are these are civilians who've done nothing. And the Saudi Arabians are bombing them. The U.S. is providing targeting data, is providing all sorts of intelligence to help them. And no one is saying a word. And when you had actually some guy in the UN envoy to Yemen, who objected very slightly to what Saudi Arabia was doing, of course, Ban Ki-moon, who's a great U.S. poodle, immediately kicked the guy out, booted him out of his job, and put someone in that the Saudis wanted. So, the Saudis spend billions of dollars in the U.S. on PR firms.
Yeah.
And they get what they pay for. They don't get a lot of bad press. They're able to buy the way out of it. And this is one of the most, I think, horrific chapters that nobody is paying attention to. And even, Dr. Paul and I have done a few episodes, a few videos on it, and sadly enough, they always, maybe we just do a bad job, but they always seem to be the lowest watched. And nobody's paying attention to this, but as Moon of Alabama pointed out, Saudi Arabia is creating an enormous Gaza in Yemen, and it's just absolutely disgusting.
Well, could you maybe just give us a review again as to why the Saudis, what have the Saudis got against Yemen? Could you go over that with us very briefly, perhaps?
Sure. Well, as a part of these wonderful Arab Springs that were supposedly spontaneous uprisings in favor of democracy.
Right. We had nothing to do with it. It's just...
No. They wanted to be free. That's what happened. And they just happened coincidentally.
Happen all at the same time.
They all happened at the same time, and they all elected people who were friendly to the U.S.
Right.
In varying degrees.
Yeah.
So in Yemen, the same thing happened. There was a longtime military dictator who was relatively friendly to the U.S., but he was kicked out in favor of a gentleman called Hadi, and he was extraordinarily submissive to the U.S. He's the one who allowed the U.S. to start conducting drone strikes in Yemen, and for about 4 or 5 years. And, that killed a lot of civilians and really ticked a lot of people off. So the people finally decided they'd had enough, and this particular tribe, the Houthis, they went on the move. They went on basically on the warpath, and they are a majority in the northern part of the country, and they went on the warpath. And they essentially overthrew this puppet. And he, of course, fled to Saudi Arabia, and from his safe residence in Saudi Arabia, urged the Saudis to bomb his own people, which, if you remember, in the case of Gaddafi, even being accused of bombing his own people, which never happened, that was excuse enough for him to be overthrown.
Yeah.
But when Hadi cheers on the bombing of his own people...
It's okay.
It's okay. So
not only is it okay, it's what we want. So we want that...
Kill him.
We want that because we are in bed with the Saudis, I guess, huh?
Yeah, and we want to put Hadi back in power. He is a puppet. The Saudis like him. He's a Saudi puppet. He's an American puppet. So they want to put him back in power. So that's what it's all about. Bring the country to its knees, crush the country, put this dictator back in power, who, he ran unopposed for the election and got 99% of the vote. Mm-hmm. So this is a great Democrat that the U.S. is trying to put back in power in Yemen. But in the meantime, guess who the Houthis, who Saudis are bombing, guess who they fight most aggressively, and that's Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
So with the U.S. and the Saudis hitting the Houthis so hard, Al-Qaeda has made unprecedented inroads in Yemen now. Al-Qaeda is the real victor in the Saudi bombing of Yemen, which is... If we're supposed to be at war with Al-Qaeda, it's to me, it's amazing that both in Yemen and in Syria, we're at war with Al-Qaeda's enemies. Mm-hmm. Does it make any sense, Jay?
It doesn't make any sense, except that I know that we have something still in place called the petrodollar, and we've aligned ourselves with the Saudis to maintain that petrodollar. And I'm just wondering... to a certain extent, the Saudis and the Iranians, of course, don't like each other, do they?
No, not at all. And this is, in some ways,
part of the issue.
Yeah, it is. It is part of the issue. Although the Houthis, they say, are Iran-backed, but that really is Saudi propaganda to make it look like the Saudis are doing the Americans and the Israelis bidding by beating back the Iranians. The Houthis, they are Shia, but they follow a type of Shia that's much closer to the Sunnis than the Iranian Shia. So that
Oh,
all of that has been very much overplayed. And everyone says, "Oh, well, if they're not backed by Iran, where did they get all these weapons?" Well,
hmm,
don't you remember just before this started, there was a story that came out that the U.S. somehow had misplaced $500 million worth of weapons in Yemen.
yeah.
They're probably paved in weapons.
Well, and so the what seems to be the irrationality of war somehow comes into focus as being somewhat rational for an elite group of people, which leads me to the last issue I'd like to ask you about today, and that is an article written by Ron Paul, "The New Militarism: Who Profits from It?" And maybe you could just pass along to our listeners the points that Dr. Paul made, and there's several parties that clearly an elite group of people that clearly do quite well from ongoing military efforts and wars that the United States is constantly instigating.
That's why everyone lives so well inside the Beltway. That's why you have all of these mansions in McLean and Great Falls in Virginia, because people make a fortune off of the military-industrial complex. And sadly enough, they propagandize the rest of the country that has to work and pay for it. You know,
Yeah.
they'll wave a few flags, and people will still, unfortunately, are brainwashed about this. But Dr. Paul's column was basically about this new Cold War is really paying off for some well-connected people.
Hmm.
And he just gives a couple of examples. The Germans are buying 100 more Leopard tanks, which are going to cost $500 million. That'll help their military-industrial complex. The U.S. is refurbishing Cheyenne Mountain, which is where we had our sort of Dr. Strangelove underwar Cold War bunker, or underground Cold War bunker. They spent $1 billion putting this old relic back online, and that was done by Raytheon, which is a big defense contractor. And as Dr. Paul pointed out in his column, organizations like Raytheon fund all of the neocon think tanks, like the Center Institute for the Study of War, that pushes more war, so they get a return on their investment. And NATO, that dinosaur that should be out of business at the end of the Cold War, is building a massive, expensive new headquarters that was supposed to be $300 million and now is well over $1 billion in cost.
And this is in Belgium, I believe.
This
Huh?
is in Brussels, so it's great for business, for all business, construction, and the military-industrial complex.
Hmm.
So all of this massive spending on an absolutely contrived new threat, new Cold War threat. And Dr. Paul points out that the real enemy actually is us, the taxpayer. We're the ones that the government hates because they're robbing us. They're robbing us to pay for this new militarism. The idea that a war economy is good for the economy is, as he said, one of the most horrific myths of all time. That we benefit from building things to blow things up, instead of building things that we can actually use in our lives.
Well, it fits with Keynesian economic theory. Military
Absolutely.
Keynesianism, I think, is what Dr. Paul calls this policy, the military-industrial complex. It's military Keynesianism. Keynes thought it didn't make any difference whether you dig a hole and fill it back up and dig a hole and fill it back up and pay people to do that, whether they were producing anything. The Keynesians don't understand the supply side of economics. They only see the demand side, and they think that if you just keep putting money in people's pockets and generating animal spirits, so-called, then you can keep the economy growing. You don't have to worry about your balance sheet. You don't have to worry if you can pay your rent or if you can put food on your table. As long as the government can print more money, you just go to it. So from that perspective, from an economic perspective, as insane as it is, military makes a lot of sense, except that, as Dr. Paul points out in his article, that is one of the most, as Dr. Paul says, one of the most pervasive and dangerous myths of our time, is the way he put it, is that the military spending benefits the economy. This could not be further from the truth. Exactly, it can't be further from the truth, because you're not providing anything of use to the economy, and the supply side is not being well, we're not getting the supplies of things that you actually need. We're diverting our resources that could make people's lives better in order to destroy the lives of people. And as you say, the people in the Beltway, they benefit very nicely. I have to ask you, Daniel, this Cheyenne Mountain thing, the bunker, was that to put our ruling elite in times of a nuclear war? Is that where they're going to go? Is that why that was created?
That's a great question because in the articles that I've read about it, they all ended with the same thing, that the military refused to say who's going to get to go to this underground protection
Right.
zone.
Right. I suppose it will
It's
be
for
the
them.
neocons who trigger World War III.
There's probably the Bill Crystal room that people
Right.
will enjoy.
Right. 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 Well, if there's a God in heaven, these guys will get theirs ultimately as well. I believe that. But in the meantime, the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity lays this stuff out on the table for people to look at. I mean, if we can get people to spend just, a half an hour or less of the week looking at, engaging and indulging, I should say, in bread and circus, and a half an hour a week to look at the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, if we could just get 1% of the American population to do that, we would be in so much better shape, I think, in terms of understanding the truth. And if the politicians could get, or if they even cared to get, I suppose they're not paid to get this information across that Ron Paul pointed out, that it's really the really the middle class that is the enemy, not Putin, not Russia, not the Ukraine, not any of these other places. It's really the middle class. If the middle class could understand that simple concept, I think things could actually change in this country, Daniel.
Yeah, absolutely, Jay. You're right. You're right.
So, anything else this week? What should we watch for next week, do you think?
Well, if I can do one little shameless plug, if you don't mind,
No, please.
I'm really kind of happy today because today is our second anniversary at the Ron Paul Institute.
Oh, excellent.
We've survived 2 years. A lot of people said we wouldn't and couldn't and shouldn't, but we've survived. We're moving into our third year now, and we're very excited. I think we're stronger than ever. We're still making do on a shoestring, but we're doing so much more, and we're looking forward to a real prosperous third year. So we would love to have more people have a look at what we're doing and drop me a line and tell us how we're doing and how we can improve. And, the sky's the limit, I hope, for us.
Well, I hope so too, Daniel. I think anybody who really champions truth, and as we've said, in war, truth is the first victim. And so you guys have done a great job. Congratulations on keeping it alive, you and Dr. Paul. And our listeners, please consider contributing to the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Go to the website. It's very easy to do. Even a few dollars will be helpful because I know Daniel personally. I've known him for many years, and I know the kind of person he is. I know the kind of person Dr. Paul is. I've met him several times. You won't find a more humble servant of the people in elected government, in my view, than Dr. Ron Paul was, and he continues to serve other people by purveying by putting out the truth, seeking the truth, and telling people and sharing it with them. And if Ron Paul was living as an extravagant lifestyle, if he was one of these people that drives expensive cars and has mistresses on the side and does all those kind of things, you might say, well, what a hypocrite. But this is a guy that I think, unless Daniel, you know him, you see him frequently, I guess, many times during the week. If Ron Paul is out there with some mistress, hanging out, doing things that are out of character, let me know. And I'll stop being a champion of Ron Paul. But I think he's a person that you can trust based on on many years of real service to the public. That's a word that's thrown out there a lot. A servant. I served in Congress for so many years. Well, did they serve the people or did they serve themselves? And you've seen a lot of these guys, Daniel. What do you think? I mean, how many of them are out there for themselves? How many of them are out there for their constituency or for the country, for the bigger cause of liberty and truth that they're supposed to under the Constitution? I don't know. But,
You can tell by the ones that stay in Washington when they're done and start cashing in.
I suppose that's probably a good sign. Well, thank you, Daniel, very much, and again, congratulations on 2 years, and let's make a third year even better.
Thank you very much, Jay.